right. Hey, startup founders, aspiring entrepreneurs, and general business junkies. I am Ian Scott Cohen with the Founder Underground. Welcome to the Founder Underground podcast. Today, I'm extremely excited to feature Jason Terrell, a good friend of mine who is the current president of the R. Howard Dobbs Jr. Foundation here in Atlanta. Jason himself is a native of Southwest Atlanta and embodies the values of Sankofa and harmony. I'm definitely going to ask about that to kick us off. That wasn't in my predetermined questions. Shaped by his strong ties to family and community. So Jason actually started his career as a teacher, then became an education entrepreneur, social impact advocate, and Jason is dedicated to empowering students, families, and the leaders who support them. So with a focus on advancing self-determined lives, Jason brings a unique perspective from his journey as a founder turned funder and investor. So in this episode, we're going to dive into how foundations operate kind of internally and financially, just to give people a general sense for those who are new. A lot of the listeners are aspiring entrepreneurs who haven't really dealt with some of these different mechanisms before. We're going to talk about what grant makers look for when assessing proposals. And I'm going to turn off my Slack so people stop messaging me and don't bother me. And lastly, we're going to go through lessons learned from Jason's transition from founder to education investor. So Jason, how are you? Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. And I'd love for you to tell me a little bit about Sankofa before we dig into the questions.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you for having me on again, Ian. So Sankofa. So, I can share more about my work, but I'm pretty values driven. Like everything I do has to relate back to like a value. So Sankofa is a Dinka symbol. It's like a West African and Dinka symbol. There's a number of them, and but essentially the images of a bird looking back, grabbing an egg, but the bird's feet are pointing forward. So the idea is that before you can truly move forward with not even just generally, not even do an innovative spirit, just move forward just generally, you have to rely on your past. So I grew up with elders. My parents had me in high school, so I was raised by my grandparents primarily. Okay. And so I was raised by my grandfather, my grandmother, raised by old folks. I have my old soul, but I learned the importance of like soaking in wisdom from older folks to really help me shape my viewpoint and kind of give me some directions about how to move forward. So I apply that principle to everything. So typically before I do anything, I always try to get context first, like how did it happen? When did it happen? What was successes, challenges? And that helps me like prep, plan, for the next course of action. So I'm sure that would probably be a through line theme through some of the
I bet. I mean, you've always struck me as someone who's very intentional and, you have a very sort of poise and calm about you that now I understand that you shared that comes from having, grandparents around more often than not. Because I see it with my parents now who are now grandparents. You grow up and it's clear you just reach a level of kind of experience where you realize, a lot of us young people get caught up in the day-to-day hustle and bustle and stresses that, big picture don't actually mean anything. And having that perspective is super valuable. So I'm interested to see how that's sort of manifested itself in your work. So with that, why don't we kick off with a little bit about, actually, I just want to talk about your background and then we'll get into the foundation dynamics. So, tell me about, where you went to school and what was happening after college that you went into teaching.
Yeah. So, again, I mentioned I grew up with my grandparents. My grandfather was a minister in Atlanta. So preached at a number of churches in the metro Atlanta area, from just one called Central, which is right next to the stadium, to Capitol View, which is near Pittsburgh Yards, a number of places. So I had a chance to be around and meet a lot of different folks, and that really helped me just with my personal values and who I am. And really, when I was coming out of high school, I really didn't want to go to college. So I went to, my high school had a technical program, and one of the paths that I chose was like criminal justice. So I thought about like a career in like law enforcement or something. I don't know. I knew I wanted to be with people. I like, I mentioned like being around all different types of people in different neighborhoods in the city. And I wanted to really be on the ground. And so, I ended up going to school not really knowing what I wanted to do. I went to a school called Furman University. It's in Greenville, South Carolina, so 2 hours up the road. Thought about law. I was like, trying to, maybe that was a pathway for me, but really never had my heart into it. And so instead of probably interning at law firms like I probably should have been doing,
I
I
did
always
that.
came back.
Not fun.
Yeah, no, I didn't do any of that. I just said something I said I wanted to do, and I really struggled through college. I got first 2 years like low GPA. Just I didn't really have a direction, and I really took me coming back to Atlanta every year, every summer rather, and I always worked at the Urban League had a program called Project Ready, and it was hosted at Alonzo Krim High School,
Yeah.
in East Atlanta at the time, and it was basically a summer recovery program that I was leading, and I loved
Sure.
it. That was my first time like working with kids, and they were a couple years younger than me. I was only
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
you know, 20, 21. But they were going through credit recovery, and I was teaching them English and math and different things, and really fell in love with teaching. And so when I got back to school, and couldn't change my major. They didn't really have have a strong education program, but didn't want to go through that process. But I always thought about teaching as a potential career field. So senior year comes, didn't know what I wanted to do. Again, I applied for some law schools. I kind of sucked with the SAT, LSAT, excuse me.
Yeah. Sure. Sure.
So my options were very limited, but I found out about Teach for America. There was a teacher who was in Alonzo Krim's building that where I was doing my student summer teaching. She was a TFA colleague and was like, "Hey, you'd be a great TFA core member. You should look into this program." So I applied for TFA the last deadline. Like I was
Nice.
just slacking on it. And I thought about just coming back to Atlanta to teach. But when I was coming out of school, it was 2012. It was a testing scandal here at
Right.
APS,
Yep.
where a lot of even TFA's course size that year significantly downsized. Atlanta
I
was
remember that.
firing teachers, not necessarily hiring them. And so the largest or closest city that I could go to that was close to home was Charlotte, North Carolina. So ended up choosing Charlotte as a location. Ended up working out good. My roommate, who at the time in college was also my roommate in Charlotte, he moved up there for a job. So passed my
Nice.
continuity of relationship and fell in love with teaching. Man, I was TFA is a 2 year program. I stayed past the 2 years. Got my master's in education. I was a 7th and 8th grade English teacher. I was our team lead and PLC leads in the building, and like that was it for me. I thought about a life career in teaching. I was a football and baseball coach at the middle school.
Nice.
And around my 3rd year of teaching, I met I knew Mario, who is my co-founder, but knew him through CFA. We were the same core year, taught same grade, same subject, just different schools. And we had conversations all the time. We were just talking, like, just build relationship about different things and vent. And one day, we were talking about our shared experiences being just young men, specifically black men in school buildings where, we looked like all of our students, but, there were no other men like us in our buildings really. And so we started to have these conversations about how we can support ourselves and what does that mean to develop a network. And at the time we started this network, it was like 2013. Group Me just came out, so we had like a group chat and Group
I still
Me
use
and,
Group Me. Shout out to
I did
Group
too.
Me.
Yeah. So I don't know if folks still use it as much, but we used
Sure.
it to build network, and we started to build just like social network of teachers, and we had maybe 40 or 50 guys in a group chat. We would meet for wings and we started to meet consistently, and it was really the guys in the group chat. They were like, "Hey, we want to do more than just meet. Like, can we do some programming? Can we bring a speaker in? Like,
Nice.
what are we doing here?"
Yeah,
And so they
that's
really
best.
pushed Mario and I to think about like taking this thing that was just really a group chat to the next level. And so, we sat down and just like had a year of like trying to do different events and like think about the theory of change and the model. And a lot of things failed, some things stuck. Had a website, got a website, and ended up making it a nonprofit. We partnered with, well, not partner. We were one of the law school, Charlotte School of Law. It's not there anymore, but they had a pro bono partnership where they were helping folks start nonprofits, and they did all the paperwork for us, and like just wanted to see what it would look like for us to get started. And it really picked up steam. And initially, we were thinking about just replicating TFA. Like I was like, how do we just do the TFA model? And
Sure. Yeah.
at the time we really got into the work, we realized recruitment, and this is kind of in the education weeds, but it's just the pipeline is a broken system. And so for us to really be effective at a recruitment strategy, we would have to have a lot more money, a lot more people than just two part-time folks trying to work on this thing. And so we switched the model from like a recruitment model to like a teacher retention model. And so, there's a lot of NUMPS data and surveys that show like teachers leave just generally, men of color leave at higher rates for different reasons. But essentially, we applied for some fellowship funding. We had this model and this idea. We won a fellowship called Echo and Green, and
Mm-hmm.
provided a seed capital to really start the work. I mean, and I say seed capital, and I say it very light. Like it was a $90,000 award over 2 years that we had to split between two people. So 45,000 a
Right.
year divided by two
Yeah,
is 22.
I know
So
plenty of
like,
people who
yeah,
love that. I mean, it's a big time fellowship too. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
I've got
It was a
rejected from that fellowship 4 times, so
it was a
I no
cool
longer apply.
program,
But
but
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. Well,
yeah
let me
we
ask
got
you
to
something.
leave our yeah.
Let me pause there for just a second. So one of the big things every aspiring founder gets asked is, what problem are you trying to solve, right? And I'm
Yep.
curious, as you and Mario started, seeing the traction with this group me and everybody just staying engaged and wanting more support, like at what point did you go from just like doing the group thing to saying, oh, we should turn this into an organization? What was that transition like? What do you remember about that period?
Yeah. I would say like market demand. Like we found a strong demand for folks. We found a demand for a subset of teachers who felt like they never got the professional development that spoke to them, and they were yearning for more. They were willing to pay for more.
Yep.
They just had never been approached. I mean, there wasn't, even through Teach for America, like the type of professional development we got was pretty standard. It was a standardized development. In typical school districts, your PD is pretty standard. But what does it look like if you tailor it to like a specific demographic or subset of folks who have,
Yeah.
play really unique roles in school buildings? And I think that's when we saw, there's a market here for this, and like people want this. And it wasn't just professional development; it's mentorship, it's coaching, it's
Yep.
leadership advancement and career placement and career advancement. I mean, it's really building like the culture around making teaching cool, and like there's
Yeah.
folks who really were gravitated to that. And so that's when we realized, okay, we have something here. I think also, we were doing this monthly meetups, and we would get like, iffy participation, but there was a core group of folks who like always showed up. And even that sense of like wanting to be in community with others, like just
Yeah.
having professional networks. Is
How many
important.
people came out to these? Like, let's get to the numbers. I want to make people feel good about starting small.
Nah, like two. One first was Mario and I.
Yeah,
Then
yeah.
We did another lucky month. It was like maybe a guy named Juan who's actually working at PG now. It was like
Nice.
5 or 6 folks at a time. I mean,
Yep.
the highest we got, we did maybe 10, 15, but it was the same kind of core group of folks.
Yeah.
And we used to do them at have bars and have happy hours, and like I would ask the bar, if the bar can they get free drinks, and we bring 15
Yeah.
people out, and they would say they would be cool with this. So it was like no money at all, just me just
Right.
talking to people and just asking them different questions. Can they help us out? And that's how it grew. So and I would say even when we started the nonprofit and became more professionalized and whatever, I mean, it still took us a long time to get traction.
Yeah.
To now, like they just hosted their conference every year. We do a conference. Last year, 2024, it was actually in Atlanta, which was cool. I helped with some of that planning. I mean,
Nice.
it was like 500 teachers that came to the conference, which was
That's
cool to see.
amazing. Wow. And
but
just
it
so
took
people
some,
know, the organization is called Profound Gentlemen. I don't know if it goes by PG now or that's just what you like to call it.
Profound
But
Gentlemen, that is called
yeah,
it.
yeah. But I also want to point out that you're absolutely right. I think there's this kind of, if you've never started anything before, you look at people who have like a professionalized, I'll use your word, organization, like, oh, they have a nice website now, they have a logo, they've got some funding, they have a board, and you immediately think it's like, wow, okay, they're legit. All of a sudden, everything must be going great. And to your point, it's like, no, you have to build those things to get people to start taking you seriously because you take the work seriously. Like I remember for us, with our nonprofit, we still, even a couple years in, we would go to schools to we had an after school program for kids in a high school level. And I remember I went and did 2 weeks of on the ground, like in classrooms, sort of publicity marketing for our program that was kicking off in like 2 weeks time. And we were giving out like tickets for people to come to the info session after school. We spent 2 weeks at this new school every day. And then the day comes where we have our info session after school. Not a single student showed up the entire 3 hours. And so, I say all that to say is like, this stuff doesn't start romantically, right? It's like everybody has to, you have to go through those moments to really learn, like, okay, what works, what doesn't. And there's gonna be a lot of times where, you know, you feel silly, right? Or you feel like, oh, is this even a thing? But, you know, it just takes perseverance and really trying to understand who you're trying to serve, right? I mean, what did you guys learn about other black male educators through those first couple of years that really
Yeah.
informed what you did?
I mean, well, a lot. I mean, one, it was, even within that, we're not monolithic. There's a number of experiences. So even like having
Right.
tailored, we even had to even go deeper into like tailoring our development to each teacher almost, and that's through like personalized coaching. But one thing we've noticed is that to support regardless of demographic aside, these are all teachers, and your 1 year teacher has vastly different challenges than a 15-year teacher. And
Sure.
so we couldn't just offer blanket professional development either, even if it was like a spend on it. Like we had to see, what a 1 year or 2 year teacher experiences, it's just going to be
Right.
very different, and there are different
Right.
parts of their career. So we've had to segment our program up, and we broke it up into like chunks. So like we have our B to three, which is our beginning the 3 year, our mid career teachers, our
Yeah.
leadership leader, and we had the specific tracks that folks were on, and then we started to more university work. So we have like a collegiate track. So it's like we had to go from big picture, even though we were working with a similar, homogenous demographic, to even like now we have to subset it out to like our
Right.
so like how do we
Yeah,
support
you're
folks at
segmenting.
individual stages,
Right. Yeah, it's
um,
customer segmentation. It's the same thing. Again, people think nonprofits operate differently than for-profits. We really don't. It's the same thing. We just use different terms a lot of times.
yeah,
Because to your point, even if if you're trying to go into market with a new venture, you're gonna start to realize very quickly that the big audience you have in mind is made up of a lot of little audiences that all have
yeah,
one or two similarities. Hopefully, the similarity is the central problem, which in this case was just a lack of support that was relevant. And then it was for you guys to really figure that out.
yeah. So, I agree with you.
So okay, we'll come back to that story. I want to shift gears here. So after you worked for PG for a while, then eventually, right after that, you went to Walton. Is that true? Is that what happened?
Yeah.
Okay, so you went to the Walton Foundation and you were a grants officer there, grants manager. I don't remember what the title was. So what was that like being at Walton? You know, obviously a massive foundation and being on the funding side. So we'll start with that, going from founder to funder. What was that experience like?
Yeah. So, similar to a lot of folks, the pandemic, I considered it my pandemic pivot. Like I decided to transition out of my nonprofit during the pandemic. I ended up having a son. I moved back home from Charlotte to Atlanta. A lot of life
Yep.
changes just happened. My grandfather who raised me got really sick, so I wanted to be more closer to home. And just thinking about the next step. I enjoyed the work that we did. I felt like, not saying I was holding it back, but like I think the founder vision, like we see one thing, and like I needed to just remove myself from it.
Sure.
For it, and so I was reading I proposed something to my board, like give me like a year to like learn, and they said cool. So I announced a transition in 2019. I didn't fully transition until 2021. So I was like, I'm not gonna transition
Yeah.
during like right during the heat of it. Like I want to
Right.
see this thing through. So it took me about 2 years, but during that period, my mindset was thinking about the question of like how do I help get folks who don't have resources more access to capital, primarily for organizational leaders. And I thought about different pathways to do that. Impact investing, venture capital,
Yep.
philanthropy. I mean, there's a number of ways, institutional investing. And I kept coming back to philanthropy as an avenue for me to leverage my skill sets. Like I don't have an MBA. I'm not you know, don't know how to do loan underwriting. Like I can't,
Yeah, not
I'm
a
not a
finance
CDFI.
guy. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a finance guy. I thought about business school, and I'm like, I'm not about to go back to school, so
Right. Right.
it's not really my space like that. So, I kept going back to philanthropy, and it was really a number of books that I read that really helped my thinking.
Ooh,
One was
anyone? Yeah, I love
yeah,
book recommendations.
yeah. One is a guy named Edgar Villanueva. He has a book called Decolonizing Wealth, and he was a grants officer at a major foundation from North Carolina. He's a native, indigenous gentleman. So has a from the Lumbee tribe. So has a very unique experience, but talks
Yeah.
about how you break up the pockets of wealth and how do you distribute that to folks. And there's another book someone gave me called it's a oration of different or account of different stories and articles, but it's called
Sure.
"The Revolution Will Not Be Funded." So it's about each chapter is like a different article, and it talks
Gotcha.
really about the nonprofit industrial complex. I mean, it gets to really, you know, really wonky and theoretical, but it really talks about how and especially in the nonprofit space, like sometimes the best visions just will never get the funding. And so
Right.
my thought was like, how do I go into like a big system and do that? So
Nice. Love that.
who, and so Walton was a funder of our nonprofits. They were in a period of shifting their strategy because of the pandemic, like many folks. Like a lot of foundations, they took a approach of like, trying to be more targeted towards like DI at that time. Now it's a little different given
Yeah.
the political landscape. So I was hired to lead a specific body of work where they were looking at going into new cities that they've never invested in. Most of these were small to mid-sized markets in the southeast, and
Yeah.
most of these are like predominantly black cities. So think Durham, think Charleston, think Jackson, Mississippi, think
Yep.
Jacksonville, Florida, like Birmingham, Alabama. So think
Yep.
about your tier, we call them, small market cities that oftentimes don't get the national funding.
Right.
And my goal was to build relationships, partnerships, find new organizational partners, and start making funding recommendations so we can start having footprints. So, we learned a lot about the work. I can talk more about that strategy, but I mean, it was really different going from, at the time when I left PG, we were a full-time team of maybe 6 or 7. Our budget was about $2 million a year or so,
Wow.
maybe a little less than that. When I came to Walton, I mean, the organization itself is like a 400-person organization.
Yeah. Wow.
It's a $1 billion endowment. So our grant making, my budget alone for the team that I was just on or leading is maybe 20 million.
Wow.
So like that's the kind of the scale, and that was
Yeah.
the smallest team, with like 3 folks, and like you
Yeah.
had larger teams with like much more significant wealth and resources. So it just the size and the scope of work was really different.
Yeah.
And that was my first time navigating those types of internal kind of politics there too.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about how foundations work a little bit, just to give people kind of level set, because Walton is one side of the spectrum, right? And then there's a lot of smaller family foundations, similar to the Dobbs Foundation where you are now. So give me the just like basic 101. How does a foundation operate financially? Like, so they have an endowment. How does that work?
Yeah. So you have an endowment. So all of this starts with an endowment, just pocket of wealthy part. The endowment is invested in the market, in whatever. Typically,
Yeah.
the
So this
market.
is like we'll use Walton, famous, Walmart family. Obviously, they inherit a lot of wealth. They have a lot of wealth, and so one thing to do with that wealth that is not taxable is
Yep.
to create a foundation, right, and then put a certain amount of your wealth into this endowment, this vehicle. Which, as you were just saying, so let's say I put $1 billion into the endowment, and so that endowment is actually just the money sits there and it's invested in stuff, right?
Yep, yes, it's invested. There's still an excise tax that endowments have, but it's really significant. And for that an excise tax not to get 30+%, you have to deploy 5% of that endowment every year.
Got
And
it,
that
yeah.
is typically that's not just grant money. So I think that's a misnomer. It's grant and operations. So it pays for like internal staff,
Yeah,
all your
yeah.
ops, and then
Yeah.
the rest of it is grant money. So that's
Got it.
how. But that
So,
5%
so
is
let
what
me bring
is
the number
invested.
down a second to make it easy. So if I have $1 million, I create an endowment, but that $1 million is basically, I'm saying, okay, I'm going to invest this money into different assets. A lot of times it's a stock market and things
Yeah.
like that, so that money can keep growing. But per the law that you were citing, in order to make sure that I don't pay the excise tax on that at that scale, I need to distribute or deploy, whatever word you want to use, at least 5% every year of that million, right? So in this case, 5% is what, 50,000? And so as long as I do that, then we can keep the thing going. But what you're saying is, of that 50,000, I can still spend 49,000 on operations, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
paying
yeah.
my staff.
Yeah.
To be honest, I feel like an idiot saying this. I really didn't know that. Nobody ever says that. But that's really important. Okay. So yeah. And then it's just, that endowment grows over time, typically, I'd imagine, because, sometimes you make more than 5% in the market in a year.
Yeah.
And there are foundations that spend more than 5% or deploy, but But okay, so
There's a
5%.
threshold, there's a limit, and
Right. Okay.
there are different types of foundations. Family foundations, I think, are really geared not only for there's the financial incentive, but it's really to keep family together. Like Walton
Mm,
Family Foundation, all the board members are Walton family.
yeah.
They have a policy where descendants from Sam Walton and their spouses can serve on the board. So you think about they lead each of these our committees, and we have so Walton is not just education. There's environment, and there's also the home region. So it's a massive
Yeah.
foundation, each with its own leadership teams or whatever. But so
Right.
each anyway, so it's really a way to preserve family. There are not foundations that don't have family members. They're kind of more like community-based foundations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Dobbs Foundation, we are a hybrid, so we have a family board, but we also have community trustees.
Mm,
I think the more, I guess, personal touch is to preserve family values,
yeah.
do great work in the community, but give the family opportunities for leadership, and so
Mm,
and see their vision through. And so a lot of the work that I was leading at Walton, was a direct the ideas from some of the family members who
yeah.
they felt like the foundation should take this particular direction, so that's where the dollars will go.
Yeah.
And
So you
so
went from
yeah.
400-person organization to how many staff now at Dobbs?
It's one, and I have a 1.5, so I have
Yeah,
a
and
part
and
time.
and obviously you work with the board a lot. I mean, that's
Yeah,
most of the work. But just to give people some perspective, family foundations are much more common than like a big Walton Foundation.
yeah,
Just like massive companies are kind of rare compared to most businesses, and
yeah,
so smaller ones, to your point, it's usually mostly the board and maybe 1 to 5 staff, and they have their basic website, tells a little story about the family, the values, and then the priority areas, right? And so now that you've been on that side, I'm curious how, when you look at grant proposals, having your founder experience, what was that like in the beginning for you? And then, what have you learned or over
yeah.
time?
I would say Walton was very different because of the scale, and
Yeah.
we don't fund organizations. You have to have like a certain budget threshold. So if you're a small
Ah,
nonprofit, we don't fund you.
why?
And
Why is
so
that?
a lot of it is just the administrative burden. Like it takes the same amount of time to fund an organization of $50 million than it takes to fund an organization with $50,000. And so,
Mm,
from a staff time capacity, they're pumping out so many grants a year, then they have
yeah.
to hit this 5%. They're like,
Right.
look, let me just fund the big dogs. That way, I can get that reach closer to that 5%
Yeah.
number.
That's very real. I
Then
had a
have
foundation like officer tell me that once. He was like, "I have to spend 5 million this year, and people keep asking me for $10,000." It's
yeah,
like, guys, I need bigger asks. And it's funny
yeah,
because I bet when you were a founder, right, you probably were just trying to think of what's the smallest amount of money that I could get, or what's the amount of money I could get, right? That's how you think about it. Is that it's such a backwards sort of opposite ends of the spectrum.
yeah. I mean, I think yeah. So yeah, everything you just shared. I think at Walton, we wanted you to be multi-million proposal, multi-year. Like that's what we were looking for. So if
Mm,
you came to us with a $25,000 gift, you were not getting funded. Just that I couldn't even get that
yeah.
through our leadership team. And it was very because of the size of funding that comes with things too. Like it comes with we want to see more data. We want to see you move the system. Like we're looking at systems change work,
Yeah.
not necessarily direct service organizations
Mm,
through that type of strategy. So it's a very different way of grant making. This is complete opposite. So our endowment is about it's public record, but it's about 60 million. So five
mm,
percent of that a year is about 2 million or so. And so after you take out you get in operations, we're left with
yeah.
we give out about 1.5 million a year in grants.
Gotcha. So that means you
And
make 500K a year.
no, I
I'm
don't.
just kidding.
The organization has
Yeah,
to,
yeah,
we still have to
yeah.
pay
No, I'm just kidding.
lawyers
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah. For sure, for
accountants
sure,
and
for sure.
and I'm a
Okay,
one
so you
person
guys are
shop.
giving
So
out
yeah,
1.5 million plus or minus each year.
yeah,
Okay, so now,
yeah,
but it's smaller. So how does that affect what you guys are looking for?
yeah. So now we're looking for the opposite. Like I need folks who are very, very, very close to to the the things that they're trying to solve. I think
Mm,
I'm looking for folks who I think how I'm trying to frame our investments is that we want to be like risky. We want to be like your risk capital. We want to be the thing that nobody else funds. We want to be the first in funder. Where we want to, and so like most of the organizations aren't at the scale or size of a Walton yet.
Yeah,
But
sure.
I think we would love to be the organization that could catapult or organize you to, if you want to go for the Walton or Gates or whatever, like you have
Yeah.
that runway. And so we're looking for, untested, unproven ideas, but really looking the leader. I think the leader matters more than anything in this work,
Yeah.
and how closely is the leader's story tied to the vision of the work. Is this a pet project, or is this
Yeah.
something that this leader is really going to commit to drive some like deep change within the population they serve?
Is this
It's
a
very
is this
different.
a strategy and vision that you brought to Dobbs, or is this how they also operated too?
Yeah, I think this is a little bit of how they operate. I mean, just given the size and scope of the of funding,
Yeah.
I think they've operated in a way where it's relational. Like we don't have a way to track data. Like I'm a one person shop.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
no data team behind me. So I'm not tracking your reporting. Like I need to know that you can uh, do the work, and
Yeah.
that's a pro and a con. Some of that is highly relational. So
Right.
if you are in a relationship, then that really benefits. And if you're not in a relationship,
Yeah.
there's a challenge there. And so like part of my job is to figure out how we can expose our foundation just to new populations, new markets,
Yeah.
new people, new organizations.
Right.
And so, but yeah, I would say the relationship, the leader is probably the core of how we think about our funding.
Yeah, it's funny to think about the parallels between this, I'll call it nonprofit investment for lack of a different term, and for-profit investment. So in like the startup space, right, you've got kind of pre-seed funding. It's usually family and friends or angel investors, and that is very much like I'm just betting on the person, pretty much. I mean, usually they have an idea that's not even in the market yet. And that sounds like kind of where you guys are playing, because that's, one of the things we were just talking about in a recent workshop I did was this concept that successful entrepreneurs are effectual thinkers. I don't know if you've heard of that concept before, but it basically is just a fancy way of saying like they focus on what they have and what they can do with that and how they can really leverage what existing assets and skills and relationships they have to make progress. And in a similar way, I think that I love how you and Dobbs, it's like, okay, we're not Walton. Like we don't have that scale, and we're not going to ever have that scale. That's not really why we exist. So what do we have, and how can we affect change in the way that we want to using what we have? And it's betting on inspiring leaders who have visions that really just need someone to take a chance to let them get going, right? Because if you don't have money, it's very hard to get something off the ground at a certain point.
I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, we know that an average gift from Dobbs maybe it's 30 to 40,000. So we know that's not going to transform anything or an organization. It definitely helps. Like without the capital, you can't. It's hard to just actualize some of the vision. But we want to make sure that we're helping. Also, there's an acronym in philanthropy, or just generally, it's called SMERFs. It stands for social, moral, intellectual, relational, and financial capital. So the idea is that good grant makers should use and leverage their SMERF, right? They should be helping you make social connections. They should be maybe speaking out on issues, leveraging their moral capital. I mean, we have a lot of data, like, we don't necessarily know what to do with it yet. But we have reports. I mean, we have access to information, so we can definitely leverage that. Relational capital, like I said, we, of course, make grants, connections to other partners, other foundations, but other partners as well. And then, of course, the financial capital is something. So we have to leverage more than just the financial resources.
Yeah, no, I've never heard that before. It's an interesting acronym. That's cool. It's good to know that the foundation world has, things like this. It's so opaque from the outside, right? Like it's very hard to understand what goes on behind these closed doors. And for most people who apply for funding, you end up just hating foundations just because you get rejected so many times, right? Yeah. And it's not because they know you. It's not because they actually like insult you or anything. It's just because you get that generic email. We had a lot of really, competitive, great applications. Don't have endless amounts of money. And so with that in mind, I guess thinking about having been on both sides, what's the biggest misconception you think, new and aspiring entrepreneurs have about foundations or grant makers and vice versa when it comes to this kind of work?
Yeah, I think the biggest, I've experienced this at Peach Profound Gentlemen. I definitely experienced this at Walton, and I'm thinking about this here at Dobbs, is that foundations are a very small piece of like the funding pie. Like we don't have. I mean, there's not enough foundation capital to solve any issues that folks are dealing with. It's going to take the public system, in my opinion. So I think one misconception often that we get is leveraging our Walton or Dobbs or whoever foundation as your like forever funder. Like it's like we don't have the capital. There's a lot of other work, like especially our organization where we want to be a startup risk capital kind of investor, which means we have to go to the next thing maybe in a year. We just have to. And my viewpoint is just Jason talking, not necessarily Dobbs. I think we have to put more pressure on public systems to do the work that public should be doing, especially with topics like education and health, where there's a right to education as public school systems. Atlanta, the folks who are in Atlanta, they have over almost a $2 billion budget. I know the challenges are pervasive and there's not enough money, but there's got to be more accountability on that public level, and that's where I think I would love to figure out how we can support nonprofits and just the system period. How do we leverage that capital that we do have to move the public system along, to make investments in nonprofit leaders. So when I was with Profound Gentlemen, I had a funder tell me that very authentically and upfront. Is like, look, you got to diversify your funding stream beyond like foundations. You can't be 90% relying on me. Because we're gonna switch priorities. I gotta invest. We gotta bring new things to our trustees, and so that really pushed us to like double down on earned revenue, specifically like district and school related contracts. We hired a team member for that. I mean, some of it was successful, some of it was not, but like we do have established partnerships, and it doesn't cover a significant portion of even the budget then, but it was something. It was 20-30% of our revenue was coming through these current contracts. So that's the piece where I think it's a misconception that I want to be a more community with, to support a lot of nonprofit leaders and helping with some of that funding diversification, specifically by targeting some of the public system actors.
Yeah, no, I think you mentioned a couple of things that are really, really profound, and I think a lot of folks don't have this level of nuanced understanding. So first off, on the public side, the government public systems get bashed all the time for ineffectiveness, inefficiencies, all this stuff, right? And a lot of that is just political back and forth. But people need to remember, I think, that the scale of the public system wealth, finance, is just dwarfs the abilities of any other individual actor, right? What's Congress got like $1 trillion budget every year now or something, which even if you think about Walden that has $1 billion annual, it's like, it's not even the same scale. And so when we're saying that, the public systems really at a certain point need to just take responsibility or take a more active role maybe in some of these things, it's not because, we're on one end of a political spectrum. It's just sheer resources, right? It's like there's a reason when we all pool capital together, it gives us so much, financial influence from a systemic standpoint. It's also why it's so frustrating when those systems don't actually solve some of these pressing issues that seem basic and necessities for us who are on the ground. The other thing you said, which I think, again, going back to a lot of impact founders, especially, you start to really develop a deep resentment of foundations, is that piece about sometimes foundations do switch priorities, but sometimes their priority also necessitates them not funding you anymore. Right. So you guys are a perfect example. And the same thing is in the startup space too, right? It's like pre-seed funders or angel investors are not going to fund a Series C, round. And when you hopefully grow to that level, like, that's great. You're going to find other investors, and they're going to, love that you did that and probably make a bank off of it. But it's just, everybody's playing a different role. And so, for instance, with you guys at Dobbs, it's like, if you gave me $20,000 to get going, and like, you want me to get going, right? And to get to that next level where I can kind of grow my impact and do my thing and not need you guys, so that you can go on and find the next me or the next you. and that's just your strategy and the way you use your resources. And I think too often we make it personal and about sort of loyalty, or other sort of moral and ethical judgments that honestly, don't get me wrong, there are people out there that are not great actors, or maybe I don't agree with their decisions, but ultimately everybody's got priorities, everybody's got people to report to, and so respecting that in the financial sense as a nonprofit leader is super important to that financial sustainability piece. We dealt with this too. Very early on, people were like, you got to have diversified funding, and I've seen it happen. Like I've seen a nonprofit, I think I mentioned in a previous podcast, I saw a nonprofit lose like a third of their budget because one grant just like wasn't there anymore, and it crippled them for years because they weren't planning appropriately, in my opinion. And so with that, what advice would you give to aspiring founders, especially ones in the nonprofit or impact kind of headspace, trying to balance this idea of like social impact with financial sustainability? Because I think a lot of people start saying, oh, you went out and tried to earn revenue. Well, you're not a nonprofit anymore. Well, that's not actually accurate. And I think some people view money and earning it as sort of a corrupting force. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you think about that and how your advice you would give to somebody.
Yeah, I mean, you have to. I think there has to be an earned revenue strategy within every nonprofit. I don't care if it's selling a t-shirt. That's, there has to be something. And that's how even at Profound Digital, we started off with like our branding. We were trying to make it cool.
Sure.
We started selling t-shirts. We have membership fees, $25 for the year. Not much, but it's something. It covers some costs. We started to develop much more of like a robust funding, like earned revenue infrastructure. But you have to. And I think oftentimes it's not always about charging your constituency. Sometimes maybe working with kids or, house folks. Like it's about your intellectual capital. And that's something that I saw really at Walton is in a lot of your major nonprofits aren't, selling, they're charging their constituents. They are providing thought leadership on topics and charging consulting fees, right? They may have a consulting arm built into their nonprofit. I saw that so many times where they offer their core service, but they also have other clients that they just give their thought leadership to. So I think it's about making yourself marketable, whether it's you as the leader, something within your business infrastructure that you could think of that you could do to bring more earned revenue to the table. I mean, for us, it was because we were working with education. Most of the teachers we were working with are at a school. Schools have budgets. Like it made sense for us to like go to the school, and not all of it worked. Some it was like a no. Some of it was like, we'll pay for the $1,000 professional development. Cool. Like I think we had to get to like our cost per learner, which was about $1,500 for the year, and we just tried to think about how do we chip away at $1,500 as much as reasonably possible, and then we had to rely on philanthropy for the rest. And that's but every year we were trying to chip more of that $1,500 down essentially. But I would encourage every nonprofit leader to think about a social impact strategy, think about an earned revenue model. Even at this basic of just selling a t-shirt, like it has to be, you have to have something else. And like you said, I think, at Walton, I saw this a lot. There's a rule of thumb at Walton. We don't fund organizations at a specific budget threshold. And a lot of that is we don't want you to, if we pull funding out, our funding is at the size that it could cripple you.
Right.
And so, we typically don't, whereas Dobbs will fund 100% of a project. Our funding is smaller. So it's, hopefully, and it still may have some detrimental effects, but you losing a Dobbs grant probably won't have the same weight as you losing multi-million-dollar grants.
And that reflects on the foundation too, right? If they change priorities or something happens in the market or, whatever, other things come along and they pull their grant or they just don't offer it up again. Then an organization fails, then everybody's going to, people in the organization sometimes will point to the grant maker as like, hey, you kind of left us in the lurch. It's like, well, you also have a responsibility as the leader of your organization to make sure you're prepared for every eventuality, right? And I think that's something that it's tough when you really care about the impact. You come from that place of, altruism almost, where you believe it's like, look, what I'm doing matters. It's important. It's affecting real lives. Like, people should support this because it's good in itself. And we all feel that way. There's a lot of work out there to be done.
Yeah.
And we just don't, as our point before, it's like we don't have endless amounts of money to put towards it. And so that's what you as the entrepreneur need to figure out, how to make this work. I'll also add to what you were saying. Earned revenue is certainly a huge part of this. The other way to think about it too is diversified in the philanthropic sense as well, right? It's like we started and built up like a really solid individual donor base, and then we had corporations built into our programming, and so that developed into a little bit, and then grants came along later as we got more track record. So even that diversification, I think we even put in like our strategic plan that we would not have one stream be over like 30% of our budget unless it was like a capacity building thing or something. But yeah, you really have to think strategically about that. And I think a lot of times when people starting impact programs or trying to start a nonprofit, you come from such a moral and ethical place that you almost feel like talking about money and financial planning and strategy is either at worst it's dirty and at best it's just beneath you. But in reality, it's like, people got to be paid to do this work. You need money to make the work happen. I'm going to you and asking you for your money. You obviously have priorities and things you're trying to do with it. So I think some of it is just a little bit more intellectual honesty sometimes as a founder. Same thing goes in the for-profit space too. It's like, it really sucks to get turned down by an investor. And I've been turned down by many, as I'm sure you have. But at the end of the day, it's like, it's their money and they have their own way of thinking about it. And so if I couldn't convince them, that's kind of on me, unfortunately. So yeah, I think that's such an important point. Well, I know we're almost at time here, so I want to give you a chance to any last sort of thoughts or recommendations you can give to aspiring change maker, entrepreneur, who's just kind of starting out or has their idea they're working on and is ready to start telling people about it. And any just advice you would give based off your experience?
Yeah, the biggest thing that from what I've experienced leading a nonprofit, even in this seat, is the importance of the team dynamic. So, I was a co-founder. Mario, my co-founder, did not do this. He did not touch the finances, the budget, and that wasn't his space. And he was like, look, he couldn't, like you shared, he came from a very moral, ethical, like altruism, like that's his viewpoint. And when I mentioned the values, everything we did was centered on values, and I would really credit Mario for like building the culture. And he wanted to like really do that work internally, like build our culture, think about the values of our organization. And so, I raised my hand to step into the other space, and so that I didn't have any background beforehand, but really had to dive deep into that space. And so I would say not every leader is going to be positioned to do this type of work either. The funder diversification fund. I mean, that takes it almost takes you outside of the work to a degree. Like I found myself less with teachers, more in foundation rooms and courtrooms, and like that's the nature of the work. And that wasn't why I initially got into it, but I started it. But I realized you have to have that engine operating at full capacity for Mario to do the work that he's doing. So my thought is, pushing folks to really understand their gifts. Not everyone wants to be nor needs to be in that space. You could be a person who really thinks about the program elements, the culture, running the operations piece, and that's it, and that's enough. And we even internally, we built a culture where it did not matter what your role was. Like everyone was valued at the same level, even down to pay almost. And so just want to encourage folks to think about their personal gifts and skill sets, their team dynamics. Maybe it's elevating someone internally who could really play a role in this room, or maybe it's letting go of some of the things that you're holding to make room for other folks to really step up and own. So
and this is where having advisors, having board members, really being honest with yourself about what your gaps are and also what you don't really want to be as much involved in. I think that's a great place to leave it. I mean, and again, going back to effectual thinking, start with who you know and what you have in front of you and kind of build from there. But this has been really helpful, Jason. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been great catching up. Thank you to everybody for tuning in to the Founder Underground podcast. We hope you enjoyed this insightful conversation with Jason Terrell, the president of the Dobbs Foundation here in Atlanta as he shared his journey from founder to funder, along with valuable tips on navigating the world of foundations and grant making. If you found this episode to be helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe, leave a review. It helps us bring more impactful stories to founders and aspiring entrepreneurs. If you want to learn more about Jason's work, you can look up the R. Howard Dobbs Jr. Foundation online. I'll put the link in the show notes here. You can also look him up on LinkedIn. Hopefully we can flood him with a bunch of connections over time. But stay tuned for more episodes. And as always, keep building, keep growing. Thank you, Jason, once again. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again. Appreciate it.